So, in the past I have made small follow-up amend videos to address interesting problems or correct things that I've said in other videos. Remember I did that with the Emperor series, and often it's where we're getting into heavy stuff like Origins of Chaos or the whole crazy, vague timeline of the Emperor, because sometimes questions arise after I've posted a video that are actually worth getting into. And speaking of the Emperor, a wild tangent in the first paragraph. I actually remembered where it's more clearly stated about the Emperor's dealings with Chaos. Remember I was talking about that in Emperor Part 4. It took me a while to find it, but it's actually in the novel First Heretic, and it's literally the only place in the entire lore that I can find, I think, that it's clearly mentioned. Also spoken by a demon, so you know, pinch of salt. But anyway, that the demon even goes to explain what it is that the Emperor is supposed to do in exchange for the information he got. And basically it's just tell humanity about chaos. And that's always been the thing, that's always been that question about why did the Emperor not tell everybody about chaos? And most people always presumed the reason was that, hey, if you go around and you say to people, hey, did you know that there's all these gods and mystical beings in the galaxy, and if you treat everybody horribly and you do loads of bad shit, you can have all sorts of powers, live forever, blah blah blah, and so on and so on. Generally seen that telling that to humans who tend to be very self-centered, power crazy, and all these bad things, telling that to all humans in the galaxy, it's probably going to destroy everything. So that's likely why the Emperor didn't do that. But anyway, First Heretic, if you want to go look, that's where it is. Anyway, as I said on a community post on Twitter yesterday, consuming the lore of 40k can be quite mentally all-encompassing. There's many memes about this and how family and friends get pushed out of your brain to make more space for lore stuff. Comically for me, that's literally often true, as some of my wider family got annoyed at me this week for apparently something's happening at this time of the year and you're meant to send people things or something. Anyway, I don't know. But it's very strange how often your brain can just twist things upside down sometimes. Because you guys know, I always try extremely hard to be accurate with any discussion points and details within videos. These things are important, and that's despite the incredibly vague, often contradictory nature of lore in the 40k verse. Still though, I'm not a machine of the Mechanicus, and despite my best efforts, there are sometimes still specific bits of lore that I always seem to mix up and get brain fog with. For example, my confusion of repeatedly mixing up the Interax with the Oretian technocracy. It's one of my most consistent errors, so much that I feel like tattooing it on my arm so I don't forget. And the other problem when it comes to talking about the lore is that sometimes when I'm discussing a specific point, I may omit mentioning a specific node of information that in my own head is perfectly clear, but when listened back by others, it can seem less clear or even wrong. And this is a consistent problem for actually me or for anybody even trying to discuss something as complex as the 40k verse, but it applies equally to almost anything with a very deep background or a lot of information to get down. And I know historically I've actually not been great with this even in my own past, where whenever I've had to get to something specific, I often know and speak to a lot of the information around it, but I fail to mention the key points. Don't know if you've noticed this with me, but I do have a habit of talking a lot about stuff and around stuff and not necessarily getting down to the concise specifics. You might have noticed that with me. This is how I tend to be. Now saying that, I've always thought that I'm pretty good at making, say, tutorials about things when you have to distill down information and say, here's the thing, A, B, C. I'm quite good at doing that. And so if you have to speak to something that's very complex, the question is always going to be, how simple do you make it? How long do you allow to explain a specific topic? Which details do you keep and which do you omit? You have people watching who will know the majority of actually what you're speaking about, and then you're also going to have those who have only just started learning. So how much do you put in and how much do you leave out? This is an ongoing problem, and it's also why in terms of 40k, I sometimes get people who are unhappy in comments because I've repeated something that I've said in other videos previously. But that's usually because I feel it's critical information. But saying that, I can't just repeat everything forever in every single video, so I have to try and have some awareness about this. My point is though, sometimes this bleeds into what I presume can be assumed or not, and in doing so that can lead to confusion. For example, the Cadian purple eyes things on my most recent Space Marine video. Now, I greatly wish I'd just said, Cadians have got purple eyes, but maybe these are the reasons too. Now, I had to make that video very quickly on the day the trailer dropped, and stupidly as I was smashing through it, I didn't bother to mention it. But the first reason for that being, Cadia has been destroyed for quite some time, and while yes, it's believed that there are scattered Cadians around the galaxy, etc., to me this didn't really seem like the most prevalent or interesting reason. And here's why. For example, did you know also that void-born Imperial citizens can have purple eyes? That's people that are just born in space or spend a lot of time in the warp. So did you know those can also have purple eyes? Or did you know that the births of hive nobility can have gold and or purple or even black eyes? Probably not. These are all other lore details, and if you want to know where, it's all listed in Dark Heresy. But the entire reason why Cadians have purple eyes was simply their proximity to the Eye of Terror and therefore the warp. This is why Voidborn, as I said, also can have purple eyes, because basically any human that's close to the warp or exists near it for generations could potentially be affected in this way. But as I said in the video, now the entire galaxy is torn apart with a huge warp rift, and even looking upon it is enough potentially to corrupt your soul and undoubtedly have effects similarly on the eyes. It's said by the Imperial Ministorum that look not upon the demon, the heretic, or the unclean enemies of the Emperor, for it is through your eyes the foes of purity will lay siege to your soul. I think it's always important to remember, as I've often said, within the galaxy of M41, there's no straight, pure, set answer for anything. I know this greatly irks some people because they want to be able to definitively label things and tidy it all away neatly and marked and recorded in proper archival format. Except that's just not how a galactic melting pot of humanity functions. Do I wish I'd just also bothered to say maybe he's a Cadian refugee? Yes, but you live and learn, don't you? And as I've said repeatedly, we can only know things in 40k based on collective weight of reference. The more something is seen, the more we know it likely exists as stated and can be considered objectively true. Now this to me is not a negative thing though. In fact, it's why 40k can be so interesting to me as a fictional verse, because when you consider some of these inquisitional factions, say, that have been operating for millennia, deliberately muddying the water, causing doubt and confusion across the Imperium in a really invasive way, you start to wonder just what exactly you can trust, and even things that are commonly believed could indeed be false. There's another nightmarish aspect, another dystopian aspect of the Imperium. Who can you trust? Who can you believe? And it's often seen that those who follow what they think is in fact a truthful path end up being led into becoming a heretic themselves and facing extermination. Many examples of that. And that might even be before we were to consider the twisting forces of chaos. So still, as interesting as this all is, it's actually not the main thing I'm going to be talking about. So in the latest video where we were talking about Zao Arcad, I stated that during the Age of Strife it was the more open-minded worlds which fared better, and that those who looked down on Psykers did not do as well and suffered demonic incursions. Now, as many people pointed out, and greatly appreciated by the way, you're keeping me honest, that in a past video I stated it was in fact the opposite of this. And you know, it sickens me to say it out loud, but one person even asked me, had there been a retcon? Obviously the answer to that is no, and I'm not going to go off on it again. But according to the historical lore, the presumed situation is that during the Age of Strife, those planets who heavily persecuted Psykers, who basically murdered them all, like for example Night Worlds, Feudal Worlds and so on, fared better because they exterminated their Psykers with extreme prejudice so that they couldn't consume the planets with demons and whatnot. This being opposed to those who allowed them to openly emerge and be tolerated, because those worlds then ultimately suffered as they were widely consumed by these Psykers being a portal for demons and nightmarish beings of the warp. In the worst case scenario, it left planets basically as dead worlds scoured of all human life. Now I try my best, damn it, but sometimes things get mixed up in my head, and this being just one of those instances. But when I reflect on this, it's actually a tiny bit more interesting than just me speaking wrongly. Surprisingly, the Age of Strife, despite being a considerably major event in the 40k timeline, is actually a very minimally mentioned period of the lore, in terms of detail anyway. It's obviously referenced on and off throughout any number of novels, but like the Dark Age of Technology and the War with the Men of Iron, the details are extremely thin, almost non-existent for those other periods, and any references to those periods and its problematic Psykers even less so. What actually made me sit back and think on this as being more than me just twisting it up in my head was I thought to myself, why did it feel so clear to me that those worlds who had embraced Psykers had fared better? And I'll happily admit, as I said, that I was wrong on that. I'm never one who's been too proud to admit errors. It happens. You move on, learn. Mistakes are by a wide margin the very best way of learning. And as I said, I'm sadly not yet an archival knowledge magos of the Mechanicus. Not yet. And despite many of your speculations to the contrary. So when I was thinking about this, I started to unpack what it was that got me all twisted up in the head about this Age of Strife Psykers thing. And what I came to thinking is that the actual reality of the situation during the Age of Strife, as presented to us, can surely only be partly true. That is to say, I don't personally accept the stated reason at face value, and this actually happens quite often within the lore of 40k. Now, to be absolutely clear, this is not to say that I would just misstate something and just say what I think. No, not at all. The entire reason I wanted to make this video was for clarification in the first place. No, what my point is that whenever I discover something in the lore that just doesn't reasonably rationalize for me, and you all know, you're all aware that I do this, that I make a point of stating I now will share my own opinion on this and that it is speculative. I usually will say that in a video. I'll say something like, this is the perspective I personally adhere to because I think it makes more logical and reasonable sense. I've noted this many times when I interject and explain that in my speculative opinion, XYZ must be assumed as being possible, even though it's not actually stated. And so with my brain twist up, this is what I think happened here, except that I forgot to say the part about it being my speculative opinion. So yeah, I fucked up basically. But this issues of your brain steadily twisting the stated explanation into what I think sounds more correct. This is something I think happens very often for people when it comes to 40k, because the detail of the verse is so vast. We're back to the stupid Baneblade scout tank nonsense. And so people end up misremembering overlapping information. They've listened to friends who've heard from friends who can't remember where they read it, but they're sure it's written somewhere. And let me tell you, I've chased after those references that people have thrown out many times, just even for my own curiosity. Never been able to find them, even when they knew the place it was meant to be. So what it boils down to is often with the vastness of the 40k verse, at some level people can end up opting for their delusion of choice, as it were, their subjective interpretations. And to a degree, this is of course absolutely fine. It's like saying paint your miniatures however the hell you want. And as I literally just said, sometimes I myself prefer to opt for explanations which simply sound more logically reasonable to me. But I do try to hold to specific parameters within that, like framing things critically within existing established details. It's why I get so adamant about either finding a reference for something or building up a conclusion based on the weight of generally accepted evidence. This is also acceptable for me. So now let's address what we're talking about when it comes to something like specific mentions of the Age of Strife. As I noted, they are in fact astonishingly sparse. It's basically a couple of mentions in heresy novels like First Heretic and Outcast Dead, which are essentially just brief asides, a couple of rulebook statements and the Imperial Knights history, of course the ancient rogue trader and the odd ancient white dwarf as well. And pretty much all of these are very to the point and concise. But they're so brief, so thin, that it feels almost inevitable that we would extrapolate more based on the wider context that we are aware of. This, to a large degree, is what diving into 40k lore is all about after all. It's about placing your known markers down and then orientating yourself to reveal details which were either unknown or unclear, and allowing them to become assumed as a concluded result, or at least that's what it's always been about to me. So for example, in Outcast Dead, it talks about the Psy Wars, how seemingly power-mad warrior kings made war upon each other, but were in fact being driven by those hidden in the shadows known as cognosynths. Now these beings were said to be considerably rarer than any normal psyker, and many arose at a similar time on Old Earth despite their seeming rarity. Yet strangely, this has been forgotten, and very likely deliberately if not covered up by the Emperor. But it is talked about as being a time where psychic powers almost destroyed the world. Sound familiar? Sounds very suspiciously like the Age of Strife. A sudden burst of individuals who were ordinarily rare yet suddenly appeared with powerful psychic ability. It's also said that these specific type of powerful psychers, these cognosynths, were virtually immune to the dangers of the warp, which is another interesting thing to note. No warp creature could touch them, and without limits on their power and ambitions, these cognosynths became obsessed with dominating lesser men, believing that they alone could control the destiny of their species. Does that also sound familiar, by the way? You may be thinking of a certain giant gold person. So these cognosynth psychers could enter people's minds, alter basically anything they wanted. If you've ever played the game Remember Me, similar to that. Commit any act, perform any scheme, puppet ordinary humans to their own ends, which again is a little bit like enslavers. Twist your memories, write new ones, horrific beings. Now, so all of this is very truly nightmarish stuff, but also very interesting. Why is it relevant though? Well, because it highlights the fact that this idea of just persecuting psykers is heavily oversimplistic, and it's clearly not just the case that every psyker had these uncontrollable abilities and would just become this nightmarish portal to the warp with demons spilling out of them or whatever. It was not as clear cut as that. And I also even started to see some comments on the last video where people were saying things like the rationalization of pushing psykers underground that I made and thereby then becoming a problem makes sense logically, which it does. And this is why I'm a little annoyed at myself, because I think what I should have just said in the last video was, it's believed that during the Age of Strife, psykers on worlds which were heavily persecuted fared better than those who did not. However, it is my belief that there is a case to be made that on worlds which either had minimal psyker development or had the capacity to handle their training also fared well and survived, case in point being Zao Arcad. That's what I should have said. So really what we have in my head here is twisting things around because of how much time we've spent thinking about the nature of living in the 40k verse, and that's just going to happen sometimes. And when we're talking about the main references for the Age of Strife, we're really talking about, as I said, a couple of paragraphs in a rulebook blurb, the Knight's Codex. They're so brief and basically just state, as noted, worlds which purged harder fared better. That's basically it. The other segments dug up from old white dwarves, similarly not at all fleshed out. So then you start to think, okay, what about the state of the things during the Crusade? They encountered a lot of worlds which were doing very well and were not at all insane, fearful, purging societies, some of which were extremely technologically advanced. So explain, how did they survive so well? Were they just insanely lucky? Did they have no psykers appear at all? Well, not according to stated law, because that says that all worlds across the galaxy saw massive emergence of psykers during the Age of Strife. So you see, to my mind, it's very difficult to begin purging something like psykers from society as well. In fact, the only reason the Imperium is so successful at it is largely due to the Emperor having established things like the Sisters of Silence, and then of course Imperial training programs for sanctioned psykers, the Inquisition, people going on these galactic hunt for these poor saps who exhibit uncontrolled psychic ability, not to mention the fact that people are just told to be much more aware of that and they know what to look for now, and then they're carted back to Earth for sacrifice or perhaps, if they're lucky, Imperial training. So to me, this blanket idea that feudal worlds, fearful worlds who just heavily purged psykers emerged unscathed, it doesn't make any sense to me. You have to remember that during the Age of Strife, the Imperium didn't exist. Many of these worlds didn't have any kind of nightmarish Imperium of Mankind attitude towards things. Who knows what political or ideological systems many of these worlds were having at that point in time. After the fall of humanity in its golden age, it's likely there was a very wide-ranging spectrum across the galaxy. So I think in actuality, it's far more reasonable to say that both things can indeed be true. If a society on a world like a night world or a feudal world was extremely sensitive to those with psychic power developments, if they called them witches, whatever, they burn them alive, thus saving their world from falling into dark consumption by demonic entities from the warp, I can believe this to a degree, if they were fully all in on it. Yet at the same time, as I said in my most recent video, if we know anything of human behaviour, when people start to get persecuted, almost immediately those who exhibit whatever traits are being punished tend to be hidden away and moved out of sight, and this surely will be the same situation upon those worlds. And I must say, it's even noted in some of the more recent books that even in the Age of the Imperium, where they do persecute psykers and take them away, that's literally what happens. Parents of children who display psychic abilities try to hide them, and they're not so successful because it's the Age of the Imperium and they have these nightmarish dystopian societies where they're looking out for it all the time and it can't be possibly hidden away. But my point is, the behaviour is even listed in the law as happening, so you know that in the Age of Strife that would also be the same. And what we do know from the law is that it's said that even, for example, one enslaver can be enough to destroy an entire world once it gets into the minds of mortals, starts to consume more and more, unleash new gateways for new enslavers, and so on. So my point is, can I believe that purging your population of psykers would help to minimise risk during the Age of Strife? Yes, absolutely, I think it would help to minimise risk. Do I think it would allow them to escape unscathed or even definitively prevent them from being destroyed? No, not at all. Now, what of this more speculative perspective of mine that worlds which encouraged psykers potentially fared better? Does that stand up? I would say this is a more difficult one. I think that when you think about it more carefully, it would heavily depend on how a world dealt with it. but I think what I said the other day is not correctly framed either, and I would change it up in the future. Just saying simplistically that worlds fared better. No, that's not right. Because when we think about it, worlds could have just encouraged these psychic abilities without understanding any of the risks of what they were at all, and then suffered very horribly as all those psychers running around freely just became horrible portals for nightmarish creatures of the warp, and thus the planet was scoured of humanity. However, do I think that worlds which encouraged and then also studied and carefully trained their psychers because of their advanced nature, who helped to control their abilities, might have fared better and decently? We might go as far to say even no worse than those who purged their populations. Yes, to me that is logically reasonable. I think it's a fair assumption to make. It's certainly no more ridiculous than a population on a feudal world of all things just lucking out because she told people's fortune or whatever, or they were acting crazy or mad or whatever you want. Now, ultimately, regardless, my overstrong statement in the past video was still basically wrong. On the positive side, it has given me this opportunity to speak to, perhaps, I think, a far more interesting part of 40k, which is the speculative and discussive aspect of it, which I've always found considerably entertaining. The sleuthing, if you want, the calculating, the conclusions, the discovery. How does an STC function? Why did they still need galactic trade if everybody just had an AI supercomputer which contained the entirety of human knowledge that would just say, hey idiots, I can make everything you need from that rock over there, and so on. By the way, this is a rhetorical question. I've discussed STCs and this whole issue in another video before, and hey wow, it's linked at the end of this video, how about that? Feel free to go check that one out right after this. Seriously though, I do greatly enjoy the discovery and analysis part of 40k. I know it can be very irritating though, like I said, for some that things are not always as clear and neatly laid out as they might like, but I personally always pretty much enjoy this. I continue to enjoy it. I often feel like things are moving forward actually a little too quickly these days. It would be no bad thing for the brakes to come on a little. There's so many avenues, so many dark recesses to explore in 40k, so many interesting speculative pockets of lore. So you know what, I'll finish up today by saying, do you have any interesting details that have always frustrated you and are not at all explained well in 40k? How about things that are clearly contradictory or just plain make no sense? Would you like me to have a crack at explaining them or trying to rationalize them? You know what to do then, hit the like, tell me in the comments, and maybe that'll be something I can jump on in a new series. I got a ton of stuff I want to do, some of it not all 40k related, but I'll finish by saying a huge thanks for, as always, everybody's support and throughout this past year. I'll see you all in the next one.